All right, so this is Steve Simmons on The Art of Making Things Happen, the podcast with a vet. I was going to say former vet, but you can't be a former vet. You're either a vet or you're not. A vet, host, radio show host, top mortgage advisor. He's quite colorful in the number of things he's got into, but quite simply, he is a stereotypical entrepreneur that leads with aggravation. Things aggravate him, and then he goes and conquers it. Listen to his view and opinion on sales, why it's not evil, and why people need to focus on how to do it and how to know your no. Really like that angle he's got in there. This is Ed Parcaut. Enjoy the show. Hey, Ed, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, we've known each other for a fair while, and you to say that you're a colorful guy is probably an understatement. Military, mortgage, radio host, podcast. There's a lot about you. So let's crack it down to the beginning. How long were you in the military, and what was your position in the military?
I was in 5 years, 5 months, and 14 days, but who was counting? So I joined the Navy to see the world. I got to see San Diego, and which wasn't a bad thing. I mean, when I was down there, it was late 80s. It was a perfect time to be down there, and I enjoyed it. And basically, while I was in, I was a corpsman, so that's like a medic, basically, and I learned all that. But when I first got into the first duty station, they were like, "Who knows computers?" And so they stuck me, and I said, "I do." So they stuck me in this one position that was called readiness, and we got people ready for teams and all this different stuff. And then it was time for my 18th month, where they said you have two choices: you go to a ship, or you can go to a specialty school. And I'm like, what specialty school is not on a ship? And they're like, physical therapy. And I said, that's what I want to do. So I became a physical therapist. And what that allowed me to do was go to school. And so I got my bachelor's and was finishing up my master's when I was getting out. So.
And what was the transition from military to mortgage? Because you're a very, very successful mortgage agent up in the San Francisco area. So what was the transition? How did this happen?
It's all right. So it's a long story, of course, like all of them. But so I'm getting out of the service and I'm like, okay, I'm finishing up my master's. I end up, this one guy's like, hey, he was an officer and he was doing real estate. And so I went and we were a team, and that lasted, it was in the 90s and 91. And basically that lasted all of like 6 months because the whole market fell out at that time for real estate. And so I went to work for a company where we did computers and we customized them. And then I ended up getting that whole thing through the military exchange system. And after about 2 years, it was my first mistake in business where I figured out that I took the wrong contract to the wrong company. And so I knew that was coming to a point where it was going to go away. My neighbor owned a mortgage company. And I'm like, all right, I have my degrees in marketing and all that. So I'm like, talk to him. And I went to work for him and created a marketing flyer for him. It was like a postcard. And that lasted for about a year. I was taking people from 13 interest rates to 9, and they love me. Where today, if I give somebody a 2.99, they think I'm taking advantage of them. And so it's just a different world. So that lasted for a short period of time. And then I kind of got out of it because the market changed. I went to work for a healthcare company that sold insurance. And I don't know if it was Blue Cross. It's in Thousand Oaks, close to, where you guys are. Not exactly where you're at, but you know what I mean. And I went to work there and I was in the inside sales department, and I actually was on the phone every day for 8 hours a day. And I actually started learning what people were saying through the tones and inflections in their voice. And this all makes sense in a minute. So I really started. And so when the same guy I worked for in the mortgage industry called me up and said, hey, you got to come back. It's crazy right now. Come back. And I came back, and he was using the same marketing piece I designed 2 years ago. Right at that time, I recreated it, and we went from 6 people to it was like 90 people within a few months. And he was, making $10 million to himself. And basically that's how I got in the mortgage industries the second time. And then out of that company, there was 9 companies created because he went under after he made all that money. So
you started moving heavily into the mortgage industry. And you were very successful at that. But like all entrepreneurs, and there's nothing unusual with you in this situation, you wanted to see what was next. Right. And you went off into radio and podcast. Why? Why would you take a company that was doing well and then start detracting your attention and going into podcasts?
All right, well back up. So I was in Southern California this whole time, and basically I moved up to Northern California. And when you said San Francisco, but I'm actually in the inland area, not necessarily. I'm about an hour and something from San Francisco, and I moved up here to be close to my daughter. And then basically I regrew my company, and we only did purchases. We'd only do refinances for people that we know. And basically what happened was I always wanted to be the next level. What do I need to do to go to the next level? How do I get more successful? How do I get more education? And during 2006, right, there was a downturn, and a lot of people lost their houses, and a lot of kids saw their parents lose their house. So a lot of kids, fast forward 5 years later, who are coming of age to buy a home, aren't buying homes because they saw what their parents went through. So I'm like, a lady came to me and said, hey, you want to get on radio to, because I know you're about education, about all the stuff, to educate these kids why they should buy a home. And so that's how the radio show started. It was all about educating people on why they should own a home, because that's how most people build personal wealth, is through home ownership.
That must have been quite, I never thought about the traumatic angle of this. There were a lot of kids that saw their parents and go, hell, I'm not doing that. Was it a tough time to get people to re-educate or to maybe change their perspective into getting a house?
It took about 2 years before we had traction and started getting people calling us and saying, hey, I hear you on the radio and I listen to you every week. And now we're talking almost 4 years later, and I'm amazed how many people listen to the show. And so yes, there was a huge period of time where parents listen to it, because this is conservative radio, which means the average age is 51 and older. So then they tell their kids, you got to listen to this, right, who are in their 30s, and then they tell their kids, and so it's been a great domino effect, and it doesn't hurt with credibility at all.
That's the radio show. Now,
Yeah.
What is the radio show? What's it called?
Well, so I created a podcast, but not podcast. I created a blog back in 2010. It was called Real Estate Jerky. We give you something to chew on. And that lasted for about a year and got busy. And so that's what I named the radio show, because it was just different. Right. And at first they were like, we need to the radio show that used to be up here for years was just called Central Valley Real Estate, which is boring. So the name Real Estate Jerky, give you something to chew on. In Smokehouse Studio, they took it to the nth, just totally made it amazing. They're like, we could do this, we could do this, we could do this with that. And so and people don't forget the name.
That is which is the first identity of any good brand, make yourself stand out. So you had the radio show, and then, so that came before the podcasts, didn't it?
Correct. We started the radio show August of 2018.
So what was the first podcast after that?
That was the one that you made me do. All right. So one of the things so back then I'm like, okay, on radio. So I take it back. So Real Estate Jerky, it's live so it was Saturday, 12 to 1. And that was live until the pandemic. And then it was replayed on Sunday. And then we turned into a podcast on Monday. So that truly was my first podcast. I was like, how can I take this airwaves and put it to a totally different genre, people who could listen to it, have nothing to do with our area. And that's grown. But then after that, you and I were talking, and you said that I don't like making mistakes. And I told you I don't know if I can cuss on here, but I don't know.
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not. People get very offended easily here.
Anyway, so I'm like, you're full of shit. And then I started thinking about it, and that's when we came up with Enter Edison, which has to do with your greatest accomplishments come from your greatest defeats.
So you're the typical entrepreneur, the person that goes, okay, how can I scale up? How can I take it further? How can I push it out? And now you're in a position where you're actually out there that can go, well, okay, this is where I am. This is where I came from. This is how I can help you. So you're in that kind of over the curve now, where you're starting to kind of pay it back through your knowledge. I had a conversation with you, and you actually came up with this, how did that come about, and what is it?
All right. Can we, one more thing? Because that's Enter Edison was the one podcast. My other podcast that I'm really passionate about is Helping the Brave. And that has to do with veterans. Once they take the uniform off, we help them through life. So that was my next podcast. So, but from all of this, I've been in the mortgage industry for 20 years. And the one thing I learned is sales, right? We've been doing sales our whole life. And when you talk to somebody on the phone, and like I did in the past, and for the first 18 years of my life in this industry, I sold by the phone. That's all I did. And you have to connect with people. And every time I went to a sales event, or I listened to Zig Ziglar or the greats or any that kind of stuff, They always say people don't buy because they just don't know. And I always thought it was the dumbest thing. I really did. I was like, they just don't know that KNOW. I'm like, it needs so when you asked me, or I got lucky to talk on one of your stages, I said, I need to do something with this because this is important and we need to make an acronym out of it so that people understand what they haven't done. It's not necessarily just knowledge, but it's basically means knowledge needed to overcome waiting, because most people do not want to make first of all, a decision. They make it either out of pleasure or pain. And I'd say 90% of the time it's out of pain, not pleasure. They're waiting until the last minute to make that decision because they don't want to make a mistake. And so that's what you have to do as a salesperson, is persuade them. And when I mean persuade, that's something they're already wanting to do. You're just helping them do that. And that's basically what the no means, getting to that point so they don't wait any longer. So
run through what the no stands for again.
Knowledge needed to overcome waiting.
And this came to you, and again, you said you actually spoke on one of our speakeasy stages. I remember that. But that acronym there, what are you going to do with it now?
Well, when I spoke at the speakeasy, everybody's like, you need to make a whole thing out of this because this is huge. This is, I had sales guys come up to me and are like, I've been in the business forever. I never even heard of that. I'm like, how could you have? I made it up last week. You know what I mean? Because it's like, because you don't think about little things like, getting past no, right? That's basically what I'm calling it, getting past no. Everybody's thinking no, and because objections, yes, but you still have, if people don't make a decision, that just means we haven't educated them enough on why they should, which way they should make a decision, right? And whether you use closes, whatever that is. And so basically what we're going to do with this is, I think it's going to be my second book. My first book is building personal wealth through home ownership. And so this is going to be a course, a bunch of different stuff that we're going to do, which I didn't even think about until after I spoke at your stage. I didn't do amazing on your stage because it's been 15 years since I've been on stage, but I did okay.
The one thing that resonated with me was that there's a lot of people that look at salesmanship as the close, them getting their way, them getting the contract, them getting the checkbook, and they work the funnel down to that. The first word that you came up on no was knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And the knowledge was in educating the client to help them make a decision. So it was imparting the knowledge. You identified that to get where you wanted the client to be, the first thing you needed to do was help them with their knowledge, their education in making the right decision.
Correct.
A lot of people don't identify that as the first step in actual getting the close.
Well, in everything we do, so let's back up a little. In any marketing, right? Hook, knowledge, right? Education, whatever you want to call it, and then call to action. It's no different than when you're selling. You're doing the same thing. You have to talk to them, give them a hook, and then you give them the education, and then you get them to do the call to action, whatever that is. And that's kind of how I look at it. Everybody looks at it differently, but I think it's very important to get them the knowledge they need, because we're all about education. You got to educate the client in order for them to make a decision, right? If you can't educate them, and a lot of people are afraid of objections. I think we talked about this before, and objections, the salesman's fear of objections. Well, you have to have objections in order to sell. You have to. Otherwise you're just talking to yourself. So
now, Joe Polish did an absolutely beautiful video many years ago, actually, and it can be found on YouTube if you Google it, called "Is Selling Evil?" And it was actually backed up by Eric that actually did from the Draw Shop that actually did a little sketch video on it. It was a great video, but a lot of people then and now look at selling, and we can't say salesman, because it's salespeople now, but the salesperson and selling as an evil, manipulative thing. Why do people still look at selling as evil?
I don't know why they do, because we do it all the time. I mean, you tell your kids not to run across the street. When you go in for if you work for a company and you want to go in for a raise, you have to sell yourself, right? So why is that a bad thing? Basically, selling is only all right. And there's a few guys now that say the old guys, they're wrong. They're manipulative. What they say. No, Zig Ziglar, Tom Hopkins, Brian Tracy, all those guys just say that we persuade people, which means we get people to do what they want to do already, right? We're just helping them. And that's the most important thing. Sales isn't evil. It's just you have to be okay with everybody sells. You sell all the time. I mean, you as a coach, you don't basically, it's an easy sell for you. You tell them it's an investment and then you're done.
So we first of all got to get over the perspective of or the position of selling is not evil. Selling is having a conversation to understand the client's needs, to direct them into a knowledgeable and an educated decision. That sounds a very complicated way of saying, hey, we're selling people. But today, in a society where we're barking orders, and there's a lot of salespeople out there fearing for their job because they think everyone's going over to Amazon where it's the faceless transaction. What do we need to recognize in order to keep the salesman happy and understand that they are actually in an empowered position?
Well, it's the same thing whether you're selling a multi-million-dollar house or you're selling a mattress. Let me just tell a story that ran into me the other day. I do on my podcast, I had somebody on, we were talking afterwards, and he was saying how he went in to buy a mattress, and he was going to spend $10,000. And the sales guy, he was older, and he was like, "What size mattress do you have at home?" And he's like, "A California King." He's like, "Are you sure?" And so he checked. Yeah. He goes, "Well, that's usually for tall people." Right. And so the guy's like, "You just called me short," thinking in his head. Right. And he's like, "I'm out of here." So what I'm getting at is today, even people forget that you have to know how to sell. And it's just basically giving them the knowledge, letting them make the decision and helping them along the way and whatever that is. And I think a lot of people just forget that you need that knowledge to help them get through there. And I hope I answered your question, right? I'm used to on the other side of this, not being over here.
I think that you just highlighted another thing that today people are a lot more sparky. We want to find that single word, that single context that's going to trigger us. In the story you just said there, straight away, the guy was looking for a way to find out what the other person said that's going to trigger him into a negativity. Oh, you just called me short. Okay. Isn't that just validating how bad we are today at communicating? And isn't communicating what we should be focusing on, whether it be in the word of discussions, knowledge, salesmanship, isn't really, if you drag it down to its core, we're really shit at communicating today.
Yeah, and it's even worse for younger people because all they do is text, right? And we talked about, a lot of people have talked about this, where they'll take a week to text somebody back and forth, which if they picked up the phone, they could get it done in 2 minutes, right? And so I think people are afraid to communicate. I want to know the tones and inflections in your voice when I'm talking to you, so I understand that you understand what I'm saying. In a text or an email, how many times have you sent something and people taking it wrong, just because they don't know what you're really saying? I mean, you can say you're an asshole 2 different ways, with a smile and people joke about it, or you can be a real, and yell it at them, and it's a totally different way of taking it. And I think just these days, people just aren't used to having those skills, and they need it. And that was one of the things I wanted to do, is put together a whole seminar and different stuff, on this kind of stuff, because I see it with the agents I deal with. A lot of the younger ones, I have to teach them how to sell, and they're not my people. I work with them, but I have to tell them, okay, all right, here's a couple little closes you could do to make this easier so that our clients will understand what you're trying to do for them.
I have a friend of mine in the Vegas police force that you know who I'm talking about. And she said quite openly that when the youngsters come in to actually get into the force, the first thing you're doing is looking at the top of their head, because they're so used to looking down, because today eye contact is almost an offensive thing. You start staring at someone, they can like, what's your problem? We're not used to having that eye contact, and that makes communication harder, which again makes people feel intimidated when they're being sold to. It's a constant circle, isn't it? And it's vicious to break that pattern, to get someone to understand that, hey, I'm not trying to sell you something. I'm trying to educate you on something that's going to be the best thing for you. You did it. You're doing these podcasts. Do you find doing podcasts helps your communication skills?
Oh, yeah. And radio, because if you go back to my old stuff, I'm really horrible. But like you say, you just have to get out there. Don't worry about it. Make it ugly. Just do it, and you'll get better at it. But yes, totally. It's a totally different world. I mean, and when I do a podcast, I'm looking at your face to see what reaction when you're talking, so I know how to take the podcast that way. And it's the same way when I sell. I basically, when I talk to somebody on the phone or anytime I'm talking about mortgage, I start here, you guys can't see it, but I start at one side and I take them down this whole path to this final destination I want to get them to. And once they get there, they know everything they need to know about what they're trying to do and why they're trying to do it. And that's what you need that today, but a lot of people think they don't need to sell certain things or educate people on certain things.
Two things you've identified there. One is the facial tics, the movement in the face, and how it sends you off into different routes, tangents, directions by the reflection of how they actually acknowledge something in their facial tics. The other thing was the tonality. Tonality is very much overlooked today, and the power it actually contains. And you've spoken a few times during this podcast on the tonality and how you actually get the highs and lows and how you read it. Why is tonality so important?
Because that's how you know if they're understanding what you're saying. And when I used to sell by the phone years ago, you only had a few seconds to connect with somebody. So I would listen to the phone and listen in the background to see what I could hear as I was talking to them, and then talk about what I could hear. If I could hear kids, I talked about my kids and how everything was. Because we didn't have Zoom back then. We had telephone. And I'm going to date myself. We didn't even have the internet until Al Gore created it for us. And so it was all phone, and you had to understand. And my ratio for when I would send out, and at that time it wasn't electronic for loans. Basically, we would send out a FedEx package and then we would get it back. I had a 90% return on my FedEx packages for loans, and everybody else in the company had a 40-something%. And the difference was I made sure I connected with them, and I made sure they really wanted it before I sent it out. So it's important to connect with people, and that's what tones and inflections do. It lets you know if you're connecting with them and if you're taking them down the right path to get them to where they want to go.
Now, I want to step on to Helping the Brave, the podcast you've got. You've got a few business podcasts. You've got a business radio show. You've got a healthy mortgage business, but you actually released the podcast Helping the Brave. You quickly said that you wanted it to help the military, but why?
Because I'm a vet, so basically, and I understood when I got out of the military, I kind of had a vision what I wanted to do. I was working on I didn't have the mentor, but it was me that figured out what I wanted to do. But a lot of people get out of the military, they have no idea. They have the transitioning out to their next job, whatever they're trying to do, it's not there. So that's why Helping the Brave is to let people know about different transitioning, what programs are out there. And also if they have issues with PTSD, other issues that we need, I want to connect everybody out there. There's so many nonprofits that do so many things, but they're afraid to talk to each other. They're afraid to get, like they're going to step on each other's toes. And I'm tired of that. I want everybody to get together, help everybody. And that's why I started Helping the Brave.
How long's it been going for? And what's the best way to hear it?
It's been going for, I can't believe it's been going for over a year now. Best way to hear it is we do it live Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3:30 Pacific. And then after that, it's on YouTube. So you can just go to YouTube. So if you go helpingthebrave.com, it'll take you right to the YouTube channel. You can watch it there.
And are the links on edparcaut.com?
Not yet.
All right, but it will be. Okay, so good. So you'll be able to find it. You'll be able to find out about his different. Now, you say you want to do a sales event.
Mm-hmm.
That's very aggressive. You actually want to do an event based solely on the ability to sell and how to sell ethically, how to negotiate appropriately. And you seem to have this kind of bug in you that you want to get people to understand that selling is good. Where do you see that going? Because you mentioned a second book.
Where do I see that going? You mean where is that going to be at, or when's it going to happen? Is that what your question is?
Not so much, but you've obviously got a bug in you to actually get this out there and to get people to look at selling as a good thing. Why is the bug up your ass on that?
Because there's a few guys out there right now who are saying it's manipulative, and I don't like some of the guys who are talking about it right now. I like the old guys. And the reason I'm gonna say that is we had a podcast on Helping the Brave, and the lady was on it she's from Las Vegas, and I actually met her at the Greg Reed's event. And basically, so we had her on, and she was talking about how she almost committed suicide. And then she was parked in a car in front of a library. This is how old this is. And basically she was telling the story, and I go, she brought it up, and I said, well, why didn't you commit suicide if that was what you're, and she goes, well, I was in the car. I'd lost all my money because my business partner stole all my money. I was at that low in my life, and I walked into the library, and the lady said, hey, you look like you need some help. And she's like, yeah. And she's like, go back to that back wall. It's called motivation. And the first thing she listened to was Zig Ziglar, and he told her to put on a new set of glasses. And so what I'm getting at is these things change your life by listening to these guys who've been around, and they talk about not only sales, but motivation to change things. You listen to a bunch of other ones, and that changed her life. And she owns a company in Las Vegas. She's, totally successful because of that one little thing. And I think we forget to go back to some of the old, because TNC said, traffic conversion, like everything old is new. It's like, no, everything old is the way it's always supposed to be. We're just changed it a little bit to where it works in every different avenue, because we sell by the phone, we sell by the internet, we sell by, Instagram, Facebook, you name it, we sell there, but it's just another avenue to get your word out and your knowledge out. And I think it's important for people to understand that it's important to get that out there and say the same message across everywhere, that who you are, and educate people. I hope I answered your question. I don't know. I got a tangent there.
Eloquently. All right, as we wrap up near the end, where is the best place for people to kind of find out about what you're getting up to?
Just go to edparcaut.com.
There you go. Easy, simple, and sweet. All right, Ed, thank you very much for taking your time to be on the show with us today. We've really appreciated it. Looking forward to seeing the events you do and your books. Look after yourself, pal.
Thank you so much for having me.